in my big dream imagining, we get to distill the deepest stories and the truths that come out of community and out of history. When we have our voices heard and have our messages heard, we become leaders. Ietsap Oweliel, CISCM, Antha Jada-Gabrielle Pape, Antha WuWas Alwat. Welcome to the Drawing Wisdom video podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be visiting with Allan Lindley, who is also in my family known as Auntie Allan, because they bring such amazing warmth and energy to myself and my daughter, but also to communities. And I'm really happy to introduce Auntie Allan.
White Haskell Swasa, hello Auntie, Isquist Xwacú. In Niapichin Isquist Allan Lindley, Kintil Spachman nach en Keichmelch, Kul Vancouver Kikenmoot. So my name is Xwacú. My English name is Allan Lindley. I come from the Okanagan Nation. My reserve is Quilshana and Spachman, just outside of Merritt, but I've been living here in Vancouver for a very long time, it seems.
Ever since you were young.
Ever since I was just young.
It's really nice to see you.
It's so good to see you too. Yeah, powwow, and now like here in your living room.
Yeah.
In what feels like it's been a minute. You had a bathtub last time.
I've done a whole bathroom reno.
I know.
I think last time we visited, we were also doing beadwork. And we said, let's get together really regularly. This feels really good.
Yeah.
And then we got busy.
We got busy.
But we didn't get busy in like the kind of, ooh, I'm so busy Vancouver way. You got busy, like really, you actually haven't been busy, you've been immersed.
I've been immersed, yeah. That's a very true statement. Yeah, I've been immersed in language revitalization. So my mother's side, so I'm Sealchan in Tlakatlmk and Cree. So my mom's side is Okanagan and Thompson. So we're part of the Nicola Okanagans and Thompsons. And then my dad's people are from Mistawasis in Saskatchewan. And he's also in Tlakatlmk as well. But I ended up joining a language cohort. So it was a year-long session of we started out with 20 people learning the language, like going from like beginning fluency to like now intermediate fluency. So we were doing that 4 days a week. And I just recently graduated, so it was basically 500 hours. So it was like taking a bachelor's degree in like a year's time. And now I'm getting ready to embark on another session with them. The goal of becoming fluent again in my language. Which is really exciting, especially since my late grandmother was one of the last fluent speaking elders of our area, because we're part of the Okanagan Nation. So that includes like Kelowna, Westbank, Vernon, Penticton, all these colonial names or anglicized versions of our names. But in Merritt, just outside of Merritt, we're actually considered, we have our own dialect because we were so close in relation with the Tlakatlmk people at the other end of the valley, and then the Nicola-speaking people who, colonial people are just like, oh, they went extinct, but they didn't. They actually just married into the group. So then we became the Nicola Okanagan and the Nicola Thompson. And so our dialect is a bit different than the rest of the communities. And my grandmother was the last one. Her and my grandfather, he passed away 2 years after she did. And she wrote a book. She wrote a book before she passed, and she called it Okanagan Grouse Woman. And it was a collection of stories, Nicola Valley narratives. So that's the valley that we're the Tlatios, where we're from. And she wrote it as in the word she used was in Kakalwakas, so it's a path. So that was our path back to the language. And so my younger sister and I, we joined this cohort, with the specific goal of becoming fluent in our language so that it didn't die with her. And so, yeah, so I'm getting pretty fluent.
When you, I want to know, I want to know what happened in your body when you learned, as the language started to return.
Oh my gosh. It was so interesting. The work that I've been engaged with down here in Vancouver, mostly in the downtown east side, is working with our people, around trauma. So I'm quite trauma informed. I'm very aware of how trauma impacts my body and my experience through my grandmother and my mom, who are both residential school survivors. My mom she just turned 61, so it's a pretty recent experience for her. And my grandmother never taught her kids, all of our relatives, because well-meaning aunts and her own experience dictated that if they taught them the language, they were going to have a really hard time in the school. And so for me, it was one of the first kind of areas that we started learning was common foods that we would use. So huckleberry, stachalk, meat, slek. And I would say these words, and I would feel a bit of a twinge, like it was a mix between sadness and joy, and this cellular memory that was coming through my grandmother's, and a number of us that started to experience that, we were having dreams, we were dreaming in the language, but we were also feeling a tremendous amount of grief. Which just wasn't just, hey, let's learn French, let's learn Spanish, it was, we were immersed in spaces and learning a language that my grandmother was forbidden to speak, that her kids didn't get to learn, and we were bringing this back, but we're also we were reliving her pain and her regret, because that was the biggest thing when she wrote this book in 2016. That's when she passed away. She didn't get to see the finished product, but she felt a lot of pain and anguish for not having taught her kids, and when I started to pick up the language when I was a teenager, I was one of her, she has 27 grandkids, and I was the one that was with her all the time. And I think that was a big hope for her, that the language wouldn't die. So learning the language, was locating myself, and also going through all of these pieces of memory and grief and celebration. And another layer of that too is because I'm Stamia, which is a two-spirit person in our language. And I did a long, when I was 17, I embarked on a journey with both of my grandparents on reclaiming that tradition within our nation, because they had that. We had words for two-spirit people and multi-gendered experiences, which of course got erased during the schools, during the introduction of Catholicism. And, one of the most famous people in our nation, the Okanagan Nation, the Syilx people, is Mourning Dove. And she collected stories from our chaptiks, which are our coyote stories. So coyote is, Sinclair is our transformer. And in the early 1900s, they published a book. And it was the same thing, it was kind of white folks being oh, these are dying, we should probably collect them. And she, in the same way that my grandmother had kind of wrote this book, was, I want to preserve what I can. And there were stories about two-spirit people in that collection, but in the 1900s, early 1900s, with white publishers, they were whoa, what's going on here? Different gender presentation, let's take that out. So it was erased essentially from these works. And so part of my work with my grandmother was what are those stories, and how do we reclaim them, and how do we create a space in which the language has never been gendered? We have different terms for kinship, You know, like for somebody who identifies as male, their mother is Skoy and their father is Liu. And somebody who identifies as female would be Tum and Mistam. You know, and I grew up learning because, you know, like I was presented as a boy, you know, I grew up learning Skoy and Liu. And then later on when we started doing this reclamation work, you know, my grandmother was like, well, you know, you could use whatever one feels that speaks to you. So I would be like, oh, okay, so my Tum Skoy, you know, but the thing is a lot of our other language speakers, you know, they would hear me saying those things and be like, you're saying it wrong, you know, like that's actually, you can't say Tum, you're a boy. And so I'd have to do this whole piece where the language actually, like this relearning the language never felt safe for me or inclusive of my experiences, you know, somebody who's two-spirit, pretty femme, you know. But that was a really big thing about the language with my grandmother is I was able to access that knowledge from learning and like digging up what were these old words, you know, that we had for multi-gender presentation. And, you know, because when I first started using words, like asking her, like, what about gay people? You know, like they had this Western concept, you know, and as with a lot of elders, you know, there was a bit of denial. Oh, that didn't exist here, you know. But when you start to like look at the language, like our indigenous languages and our concepts of what gender is, like, of course, like, you know, my grandmother saw that concept of male and male or female and female, but when we were doing that work, like her piece was, she said, okay, so you're stamia, you're not male or female. So that's, you know, like when I say like it didn't, like that's, we don't have that because you're not considered that, you know. And so that's one way in which it's located. But then the other piece too is like how do we, because now we have like there's always been multi-ways, like numerous ways to identify in community, and as a language is coming back, like how do we create those words for inclusion, you know? Like we have a lot of well-meaning relatives who are in academia, you know, who have gathered a lot of that information. And one of the things that I'm always really aware of is like erasing experience, right? You know, so I'm really cautious of when people start talking about like the experience of trans people, you know, and being like, oh, is that more like a new thing, or, you know, like would that exist back then? And I'm just like, it's not really about existing, right? You know, it's about, yeah, like trans people have always been around, you know, like surgery and whatever else, like those don't define somebody's experience, you know. So in doing this work in language and community, you know, it's been that piece around claiming what was taken amidst this space of also like erasure from within the nation itself, of, you know, like people relearning those concepts and you know, coming to terms with their own internalized homophobia and transphobia, you know. But it's one of the things, like, we just go into it, you know, because the language is so beautiful and the language is so encompassing, and that's been a huge part of my healing this year, since I've been not doing the other work that I've been doing, you know, because like it gives me purpose and it gives me life. And it's so funny now because I've become the person in my family that, you know, like someone will call me up and they're like, oh, how do you say this? And I'm like, oh, you could say this, or you could say this, or, you know, this could mean that.
And I think as you're describing the ways that language makes sense of our different relationships with ourselves, with each other, in community, I hear really clearly it's not just your healing that it's contributing to learning the language, it's also healing your grandmother.
It is. It's so doing that. You know, it's one of the most intense and beautiful things that happened was probably 6 months in. I started to dream of like elders, and they'd be talking to me in Okanagan and in Kylkchin. And I wasn't understanding, you know, I was just kind of like, and then I would lose it, like, you know, when I woke up in the morning, like all of what they said was gone, you know, and I was still at such an early place of my language journey that when I was trying to talk to our elders about it, like I wouldn't have it, the words would be gone. And then one of the dreams that I had, I was in this room of Indigenous people, and in the back room I knew that my grandmothers were there. And I walked in and my grandmother, Lottie, was sitting there, and she was like, "Oh, Chukoi Snimat, you know, come here, grandchild." And she just talked to me in like our language, and I could understand everything that she was saying in like my waking brain was like getting everything she was saying because of this connection to what I was learning, and then where it was rooted. And that was like so powerful for me. You know, it was such a, you know, and there was this room that other language speakers were in, you know, and what that dream sort of signified to me as a language relearner, as an Indigenous queer two-spirited person, is that, you know, like I belong, like the language holds me. And yeah, it was so just, it was really, really nice, you know. And then during this whole time too, the 215 were found into Kamloops, you know, and that's the residential school that my mom went to, my grandmother, my grandfather, my oldest aunt, Shalu Telks, my uncles Qualt and Liliachen. They all were forced into that school, you know, and so being in that space and being able to speak to those kids' spirits in the language, you know, like there's so much power and healing there. And it was just, yeah. And throughout all of these times, you know, like we kept going back to the language, you know, and we'd be with this group of people, you know, and like during that whole time, you know, and all the discoveries that were happening after that, you know, like there was, as you know, there was such incredible trauma and pain, and our language instructors, the people that were helping us to realize that, you know, who are Indigenous as well, had said, you know, like this is our medicine, like speaking the language, remembering that these young people weren't able to, you know, this is what's going to carry us through. It was really, yeah.
And I think also those young people, when they were murdered, lived with the language inside them. It was still familiar to them. And so I think it's very soothing for them, because their bodies, while their bodies are being returned, their spirits have always been amongst all of us. And I don't think they even understand the concepts of what we're talking about, but the language they will, right? And I think that's like some of the grief that our people walk around with is these blood memories of what has been stolen and taken away and held hostage. And I think that's where the language, you know, the teachings are that the language is taught to us first by the land. The land is what's given us our language. And so as we're coming into becoming familiar with our languages in our mouths again and in our bodies, and opening our concepts to what our ancestors learned from the land, we're also bringing the land back. And it's a bigger part of, like it's part of the full conversation of land back.
Yeah.
Is language back.
Oh yeah, totally. Timhulauch. Timhulauch is our word for, one of the words we use for land. There's like a bunch of different words in which like you can talk about, like has timhulauch, the good land, hemhulauch, wet land, like different ways in which the land is in relationship with the other elements, you know? And a lot of our words, like in Silkchin, like they're based on, like, it's about location, right? You know, like Siilk people, the Okanagan people, you know, it's like really close to our word Silk for water, you know, and because of the Okanagan Lake, because we're a water people, like our nation goes down into Omak, the Columbia River and all of that, because there was such a relationship with Silkhuit, the ocean, and what was fed into it. Like, it's really neat to like find that everything is located in the language and to the land. You know, so that's been like a really amazing piece. And when we're looking at, you know, activism and like all of our young people, you know, the movements we were talking about, you mentioned Land Back, you know, I'm just really always amazed at how many two-spirit, trans, indigiqueer, non-binary youth are at the forefront of this movement, you know, like holding in and reminding folks, you know, how we should move in solidarity, you know, and like how we should be upholding our knowledge keepers and also creating space for our Afro-Indigenous relatives and, you know, confronting, you know, our anti-Blackness in communities and like really like the solidarity that's been happening within the movements. Like I'm so proud of all of our kin, you know, that are.
Yeah, I think they're really important in helping us unlearn, right? They're leading that path towards us unlearning. Like we didn't have that exclusionary way of that we've learned from colonialism. We didn't have that pre-contact. People weren't, you know, you weren't born and be the way you are and then cut out because of it, right? We didn't have homophobia and transphobia, and we didn't have racism. Even when white folks came here, we were like, well, we'll look after you. I mean, that much to our demise, like very literal demise. And it's really, as part of the return to all of our ways of being, like they've been so quiet inside of us and so like held down. Part of that is this real caring way that we have, this real generosity that we have not had access to.
Yeah, one of the things my grandmother would always say is our word quinquant is pitiful, you know, and she would always talk about, she said, you know, like when Shamat people first came around, like they were just real pitiful, you know, they didn't know how to be in relationship with it. And, you know, a lot of them would just die. She'd say, you know, like they come here and they would consider us, you know, like we were the ones that, you know, were kind of the backwards folks, you know, but we knew how to survive here. And so like where I'm from in the Nicola Valley, like we've only had white folks here for, less than 200 years, 150 years actually. Like my Kopsa, which is my grandmother's grandmother, you know, like she lived when she was younger in a kukuli, you know, which was what was our pit house, you know, like that's how recent this is. And when people would like see somebody struggling, you know, like these new folks that came in and they built their little cabin not that far from the reserve, and yeah, you know, like they would be like, okay, well, go check on them, you know, like that is what my grandfather would always say. He'd be like, you know, his mom would tell him, you better go check on those people over there, you know, and bring them some meat or just see how they're doing. And like they didn't speak English, you know, like they would just go over and take care though.
I just think of like the massive disparity of what we see now and how it's so entrenched in dominant culture that if you see someone having a hard time, you have, you know, we have contempt for them. We judge them for not working hard. We say like, what did they do to put themselves there? Like we don't at all, like that notion. And if we're going to give them something like an offering of, you know, a quarter or whatever the pittance is, we think, look at the good thing I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I just like the contrast, the stark contrast of what you're describing and where we are today. Those same shama, those same Juanituncan, those people, that whiteness that has taken over has permeated everything to the point of there is no generous spirit. Like that it even remains is remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, like one of the things when we talk about language, like I'm trying to find like we don't have, like I've not come across words that talk about land ownership, you know, that talk about debt, that talk about
No, because that's not relational. And everything was relational.
It's totally not, you know. I know that my grandmother would often say, you know, like when we were put here, so like in our worldview, Kulanchutin created the land, called it into being, dreamt it up, and tasked the Xwacú, which are the animal people. It's also a word for birds, for just general birds, but the Xwacú are the animal people, and each of them were given a role and responsibility. Like all of the plants, all of like the places were given a job to do. And what that job to do was to make it safer for us scale people, the people, you know, because we were so conquant, you know, like we were pitiful, you know, we didn't have fur. Like if we got too cold, we'd die. If we couldn't hold our breath underwater, you know, we die. Like everyone just talal, everyone's just dead all the time, you know. And Kulanchutin is like, yeah, you know, like tasks like plants and animals to like do that work for us. And not all of them were good, you know, like Coyote had to go and transform a number of them, you know, and be like, that's not your work anymore, you know, like some of them were people eaters, nach skeilten, you know, and that was one of Coyote's jobs, you know, which I'm sure Coyote had that same job when as the transformer they came down here, you know, and Raven, they took on the form of Raven, you know. Like, and it was all to create this space in which humans could thrive, you know. But one of the things that I was often told is like the nach skeilten, like our spirits, they're hungry spirits, they're spirits of scarcity. And what happened was when some of them changed, you know, if they weren't given a new identity, you know, like for us, Snikltsaskacha is a horse, and it used to be a monster, and Coyote tamed it and gave it a new job, you know, and it used to like kill people all over the place. But because it had a new role and it was in relation to the people, and they were going to use it to travel, they were going to use it to hunt, you know, it was able to adapt to that. But some of these disembodied things, and maybe they just didn't ever have a body, my grandmother would say, but you know, like they changed into greed, you know, they changed into tricking folks into like not seeing the relationship with the land anymore, you know. And then that's kind of where we've got to where we're at now, you know, like as a people, is forgetting that relationality to land. And like, you know, Shumut folks, they just don't have that, you know. Like one of the things I really appreciated about our work together is, remember when you came in once to do, well, you didn't come in once, you've come in a number of times to do cultural safety or awareness training with white staff in the place that I was working, you know, and that piece of being like, you know, for the majority of folks who come to Canada, like you sacrifice, like you actually give up your identity, like you don't have relationship to this place, you know, like you shed that cultural identity, you know, for this thing that's called Canadian, you know. And then what happens is you're rootless, like you don't have, like then you become really conquant, like you're just real pitiful, you know. You've got no roots, you've got no sense of like what's what, you know, belonging, you know. You can't read the spirit, you can't feel the spirit of the land, so why would you take care of it, you know? Like if you...
There's also, you know, there's the people remove themselves, you know, so newcomers remove themselves from their own homelands in the promise of becoming Canadian. There's also stolen people on stolen lands, and there's also refugees. But, you know, the idea of early settlers is really what we're talking about.
Yes.
But, you know, there's also that early settler mentality was, leave your own homelands, come here, conquer these homelands. But then once these homelands become the home of the settler, then it's remove the people who do belong here. And the violence of that is still happening because we see our own people who don't have relationships with the land. And that's what we're fighting for. That's those frontline folks that we're talking about, those land protectors who put their bodies on the line because they're deeply yearning for the land and they're fighting for us to be able to return.
Mm-hmm.
And again, dominant culture marginalizes those voices and criminalizes them.
Totally. Yeah. Like one of our relatives down here, who's been at the forefront, and is from this territory, is getting sentenced to jail, for defending his land that he never surrendered. They never gave it up, and yet this colonial government, that insists on, that goddamn word reconciliation, and that mythos of that.
I think there's also there's the myth of reconciliation when we're not looking at the truth, which is we're not even at that point as far as people in Canada. And I also feel like there is so little that there are far more people who come from dominant culture than there are of our people. And so for massive shifts to happen, people from dominant culture, people of quote unquote settler origin, intergenerational settlers, I think it's really important that they become willing to put themselves on the line. Mm-hmm. And I have not seen that shift yet. I don't see people making any compromise in their own lives and their own comfort. And I don't see the idea of land back, it isn't spreading beyond our people fast enough, and we're in big trouble. And I feel like in order for things to really shift, for the tipping point to happen, dominant culture has to decide this is worth being a part of, and also has to get comfortable with being very, very uncomfortable. And we're not there.
No.
And I think that's part of that work. That's part of that really deep work for people to understand the returning to yourselves and returning to the land, that it actually means giving something up. And for our people, that means, because our people do give up a lot. Like, I was recently speaking with a language teacher from my territory, and what she said is, for the language, when we were talking about how does immersion work, how do you give your life to the language, she said you have to trust in the language, that when you trust in the language, it clears a path.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
And it's not about sacrifice, it's actually about giving and trust, and the framework is there. And I think that's actually what we're talking about with land back. That if we shift the framework, if we shift how the conversation, like land back, that's what it actually means to me, is all love and all prayer and all medicine. I don't hear anything of like, well, it's kind of negative and hostile and dangerous. And but of course I would feel like that because I'm Huamoch Mastayoch. But I wonder how do we get dominant public, the body politic, to really get down with that? Yeah. And also, then there's something about, that's a lot of extra work for us. And that's what this podcast is actually all about, is these conversations and the good work that people are doing, so that there will be collective liberation of our people. And how do we get the body politic interested?
Right? Yeah, I mean, it's all about story. Like, I think the more story that we can tell and like voices that we can represent, like, I think one of the biggest gifts of my time here on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory has been like my work in the downtown east side. Like, I've been doing that for about 12 years, and it's always been working with our people. And I remember one of the aunties that first kind of like brought me into that fold. Like, my whole work now is like I was supporting aunties doing the work, clearing the way for the work they were already doing. And one of them, I remember, had told a story about one of those many kind of tours that come through, the downtown east side, for voyeuristic poverty, whatever that is. And there was an old Indigenous person that was walking by, and she was sitting there with this elder in, I think they were just behind the Union or one of the pubs, and this group had come through, and they were like social work students. And one of them wanted to know, like, well, what are the stories? And this elder, as told to me through this auntie, had said, you know, like, who you see back here, these are my relatives here. These are our warriors. Like, these are our strongest people in the nation. You know, they're the strongest we have because they've survived colonialism. They've survived attempts to destroy them, their families, and they're still here. You know, they're still walking the streets. They're still in relationship with the earth because they walk on it. You know, like, those are our strongest people. They're our medicine, you know, and you know, some of them have to use substance to keep them here, because if they stopped using it, like, that stuff would become so big, it would just, they could collapse under it. And that reshift, like, I was like, you know, in my early 30s then, but that, like, you know, and I'd gone to university and had studied our histories and this and that, but that was the one piece that kind of shifted to being like, these are important stories. Like, and that, like, putting, like, locating, like, our folks in the community, in the downtown east side as activists, you know, as resistors to colonialism and oppression, and being like your voice is so important, you know, and
They're refusing to assimilate.
Yeah, refusing to assimilate.
Yeah. And I think they're not, you know, the folks who live and love in the downtown east side are some of the strongest community members, not just because they're warriors, but also because they look after each other with such discipline and vigilance and care. And we don't see that everywhere. We see a lot of people turning on each other, and that doesn't happen despite really working through daily challenge. And also people in the downtown east side are working way harder than I am. Like, they are hustling all the time in every waking moment, and I don't have to do that. And so, like, they are such important teachers, and they are a huge part of what should be informing all of us to live in reciprocity and relationship.
Yeah. And, you know, like, it's been so neat too, like, to see, like, a number of them, like, going to the front lines, you know, whenever there's been actions, like, there's been community members there, you know, like, one of our aunties, you know, who has mobility stuff, you know, like, she got in her wheelchair and she made her way to Fairy Creek blockade, you know, and she represented, like, the community, you know, and fought, like, used what tools she had to give voice to her experience as an Indigenous femme, you know, and not as a marginalized person, but as somebody, you know, like, from a community, you know, that has so many stories told about it, but rarely, like, from the people who are in that community, you know, and, like, made them, like, listen, like, you're going to listen to my story. You're going to hear who I am. You know, this is who I am, and this is how much I love the land. And that's the big piece too, again, around what I'm seeing with all of our indigiqueer, Afro-Indigenous, trans, non-binary youth, like, that are doing this. Like, they're creating those space for, like, you will listen to these stories.
Yeah.
You know, not because, you know, it's a pretty story or it's, you know, gives you street cred, you know, got to, like, protest with all of these indigiqueers.
I think there's a thing about when people share their stories, or just, they don't other themselves, right? They're just saying, this is my story and I'm telling my story. And there's something in there that's really important. Like, when we uphold those voices, then they become the leaders, right? That's sort of the idea of a strong leader, is that they have people who will listen. And so it's our responsibility to listen. And And when people are not othering themselves, if we can listen to those stories and pay close attention and let those people be center and not center ourselves all the time, there's a huge amount to come out of those stories. Because those are our stories.
They are. What you said reminds me of that piece of, you know, like I spent so much time with my grandmother. You know, and she had 9 kids. She had 11 kids, 9 of which survived. And like I said, like she grew up an only child. Like her mother was in her late 40s when she had my grandmother. And all of my grandmother's cousins and relatives lived farther away. So she just ended up being like at the foot of our lake there in Xwacú, in this little cabin with her mother and her grandmother. And her grandmother had lost her sight. And lived to be quite old. She was like 95 when she passed away. But, you know, like my grandmother would sit with her, and a lot of people would bring their elders through when they were going to go fishing or hunting, and they would drop them off at my grandmother's house. And so she remembers being really lonely when she was young because of no other kids. But what she ended up doing is she would listen to these elders, and they would tell her so many stories. And so she was a knowledge keeper. Like she carried incredible knowledge. And when we first started doing our work together, I would just go and sit with her, you know, and I knew that she had gone to the schools. I didn't know what that meant a lot back when I was younger. But as we deepened our relationship, what would end up happening is I would hold space for her. And she would talk about her experience, like, you know, like her and my grandfather loved each other, but, you know, he also ended up carrying a lot of wounds from the school. So, you know, alcoholism and abuse were a narrative that she was familiar with. And she was able to share things with me that I was one generation removed. So she could say things like that she couldn't say to her kids. And she would often, when she would sit down, she'd say, like, sit here, I'm going to tell you a story. And she would talk about her life, or she would talk about, you know, like, oh, the old lady used to tell me, like my grandmother, and she would laugh, and oftentimes she would cry, and she would say, you know, like how hard it was, and like what, like all of those pieces. And I would just sit and hold that space. And I never had the words for it, but I had the feeling for it, that I knew that something was happening, like something that was really sacred. And like I would be like 12, you know, sometimes I would be 14, sometimes I was 17. And I became acutely aware that I was like helping my grandmother to process some of this pain. And like, and it wasn't about, like what you said, it wasn't about me. It wasn't about like what I was doing. It was like that I was creating this space, clearing a space for her to be able to reclaim.
To feel.
To feel.
Because actually, I think that's what happens when we experience prolonged trauma, is we can't even feel, because we can't, it's too much, it's overwhelming. And I think it's where, when we have safe people to feel with, to bear witness and sit with and let us be our whole selves, there's such healing in that, and reclamation of our wholeness.
Yeah.
I feel like we could sit here and we could do this for about 10 more hours. I'm also aware that we have to wrap up our podcast, and I just want to thank you for spending time with me.
Oh, I love it.
Me too.
Thank you. You're one of my like favorite people in this space, in this world. And I'm really glad that we get to connect.
I feel very, very lucky that you are my family, that you are my kin.
Yeah.
Haitchka
Kukukst.
Auntie Allan for joining us for today's conversation, and thank you everyone for listening. I would say that who knew how fun beading could be, except I already knew, and I hope that you all enjoyed it too. Take really good, gentle care, and for our next Drawing Wisdom video podcast, it will be a conversation with myself and my co-conspirators, Kat Dodds and David Ng. Please come back and see us again. Until then, take good, gentle care. Xwacú.